Welcome, creative adventurers. Thank you for stopping by today. I'm Debbie Cohn with Cohn Designs. In today's video, I have a variation on a Sawtooth Star for you. In this particular variation, the center will be a square with a pinwheel in the center of it. It's wonderful, it's easy. Can't wait to show you how to make it. This is part of a series that I'm doing as I sew the A Quilting Life block of the month for 2022. This is the July block. You'll want to be sure to go to aquiltinglife.com and see Sherri McConnell's blog posts and fabric requirements for the quilt along, and go to her YouTube channel at A Quilting Life to see all of the videos that she has for this series. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, tell a friend, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. That's the best way you can support my small business and my channel. You can also go over to my website and my shop at dcondesigns.com. There you'll find a free table runner pattern and a free quilt pattern in support of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I hope you'll check it out. So let's get started on our block. Up on my makeshift design wall here in my kitchen, I have the block for this month. Let me show it to you. And there it is. So let me show you how to put it together. So here's the block. I want to point out the components of the block. First, you have the churn dash border, which I will not be showing in this video. You'll want to watch Sherri McConnell's video at aquiltinglife.com for the details on how to construct the churn dash border. But the inner block is what we're going to go through today. So this is a Sawtooth Star configuration, and in the center we have an economy block or square in a square, except that the very center of the block is a pinwheel. So you have three components: the pinwheel center, the square in a square or economy block outer section of the center, and then the Sawtooth Star points for the Sawtooth Star. So let's go ahead with each of the components of the block. For this month's block, here are the things that you'll need. In addition to the usual rotary cutter and mat and a regular ruler, you'll need your fabrics. Consult your pattern for the exact sizes, but here are mine. I'm using my sloth fabric and some green background along with my white background. I've cut them to size and I've labeled them with some alphabet labels that I made myself. You'll also need a tool for marking the half square triangles and the sew and flip corners for this block. Here are some choices. You could use diagonal seam tape, you could use a ruler and a pencil, or you could use a seam marker. I have demonstrated how to use the diagonal seam tape and how to use a ruler and a pencil in the first video in this series, in the January 2022 A Quilting Life block of the month. I'll leave a link to that video and the timestamps where I show those two methods in the video description box below. For today, I am going to use, move these, I'm going to use a seam marker, and I'm going to mark the stitch lines rather than the cut line. So I'll need my seam marker and I'll need my pencil. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is mark our diagonal line on all of our blocks. What I did was I read through the entire pattern and found that I will need to make diagonal lines on the backs of block A, block C, and block F. So for efficiency's sake, I'm going to do all three of those things at once and mark off the steps on my pattern as I go. To demonstrate that, I'm going to use fabric F because it'll be easiest for you to see. I'm going to use a medium seam marker. I like this tool because I can mark the actual sew lines instead of the cut line. For me, I find it's more accurate. But in the pattern directions, it shows you to mark the cut line and then you sew a 1/4 inch away. I've demonstrated that, as I mentioned, in the first video in the series. But for me, I found this is what works best. So I line up the middle line here, the point of the marker, in the corner of the block, and the other one in the corner of the other diagonally across, and I simply mark with a pencil. And there I've marked my sew lines. When you're marking the A and the C units for this block, you want to do it slightly differently. Again, you can use the seam marker or a ruler of your choice or diagonal seam tape. In this case, I am using a seam marker, but instead of making the mark on each side of the ruler, I'm actually going to line it up, and so I make the line across the diagonal of the block. So I put my ruler right there, allow for the width of the pencil, line the bottom of the ruler right down at the bottom of the diagonal, draw that line directly across the center of the diagonal of the block, being sure to allow for the width of the pencil. I'll show you that on the C square as well. You'll want to do the same for all of the A and C blocks. In this case, we will be stitching just along the diagonal line rather than on each side of the line. So be sure to read your pattern carefully so you don't mistakenly mark it wrong. So for the next step in this Sawtooth Star variation with the Pinwheel Center is to form the pinwheel. We've already marked our stitch lines, so we're going to go ahead and sew, and I'm going to chain piece or feed them both through, flip them around and feed them back through again quickly and easily, like this. Then I flip them both around and I stitch again down the other side. Okay, I've cut the two units apart. Now I'm going to cut down the middle between the stitch lines. Next, I'm going to form the half square triangles, and I'm just going to finger press them open, pressing toward the darker fabric. I'm going to be pressing toward the darker fabric. I fold it over gently and I press down to form the crease, and then I use my nail, or you could use the pad of your finger, and press gently. Here are the 4 parts for the pinwheel. I'm going to quickly trim the dog ears. These are the little extra little flaps on the edges. I'm going to just cut those off. They're called dog ears in quilting. Just snip those off. I'll do the same for the other 2 and come right back. Notice that I didn't square up the individual half square triangles. The reason for that is I'm going to trim the block to size once we sew these 4 together to make the pinwheel instead. So now we're going to lay out our pinwheel. You're going to want to consult the pattern if you need to, but basically it looks like this. You have 1 point there, 1 point there. You'll notice they're going in a circular, a clockwise direction. One like this, there we go, one like that, and then one like this. I check to make sure I have it laid out correctly before I sew. And now I'm going to sew them together as if they were a 4-patch. So I'm going to sew these 2 together first, then these 2, and then I sew the 2 halves together. You can pin if you'd like, but you don't have to. I'm using my diagonal seam tape here for my 1/4 inch line, stitching a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. I'm going to chain piece the other one as well. I'm going to tuck it right under there and sew the 1/4 inch seam. Here you can see I've sewn the pinwheel sections together. The next step is to press the unit and then square it up. So I'm going to flip it over, and I want to press this middle seam where I joined the 2 halves. I'm going to press it open. That will help the block lay more flat. When I'm squaring up the block, I consult my pattern for the correct size of the unit. In my case, it's 4.5 by 4.5. I've positioned the center pinwheel section over here in the corners. I can see 4.5 on this side and 4.5 this way. I've aligned the unit so the center seam is even, and then I'm going to make sure that I have the same amount that's over or under on both sides and top and bottom. That way when I trim it all equally. Now that I've trimmed up my center pinwheel unit, it's time to add on the outer square sections to form the square in a square, or in this case, the pinwheel in a square center unit. To form the outer square of the center section, I'm going to lay 2 fabric C squares diagonally across from each other, making sure that my diagonal line goes in the correct direction, which would be like this. You can't do all 4 corners, believe me, I've tried. You have to do 2 at a time, flip them back, finger press them, and then do the other 2 corners the same way. So let's go ahead and sew these on. Here you can see I've stitched the fabric C squares onto the opposite corners of the pinwheel center. The one thing I want you to notice is that I have stitched just 1 thread's width to the outside, to the outside of the line. That will account for the fold over of the fabric when we flip this back to form the outer corners of the block. Then I'll repeat the same thing for the other two corners. Now that I've stitched along the line, I'm going to trim the outside section to about 1/4 of an inch. You can eyeball it or you can use a rotary cutter. I'm just going to eyeball it with some scissors. Now I'm going to gently finger press it back like this, pressing gently, not to distort. Like this, pressing down with my fingers, pressing gently. Now I'm going to add the other two green squares to the opposite corners and repeat sewing them on and flipping them back. This is called the stitch and flip technique. Here's the pinwheel in a square unit. All I need to do now is to press it and then trim it, just like I did with the center pinwheel section. Then we'll come right back and add on our flying geese. Here's the center section, the pinwheel in a square. We're going to go ahead and make the flying geese to make the star points for the outside of the block. Here I've started preparing my flying geese. I took my fabric A square and you can see that I had marked it incorrectly. If you do that, it's fine, it happens. Just scribble out the wrong lines and mark the diagonal line right across the diagonal. I did the same thing, I fixed it. Now I'm going to stitch on just on the inside of the line, the center diagonal line, on each of these. I've laid the square on one end of the rectangle, the fabric D rectangle. And I'm going to chain piece so that I can sew all of these in quick succession. Then I'll repeat the process on the other side and use the sew and flip technique to flip the corners back. As you can see here, I've stitched one square onto the end of the flying geese rectangle. I'm going to trim the excess off the outside section. Conveniently, I can use my incorrectly marked lines to do the trimming, but you don't have to. You can eyeball it, of course, if you don't have the lines there. Then I'm going to gently press it back. I don't want to distort. Press down with the pads of my fingers, smooth gently, making sure that I've completed the rectangle. And I'll do the same with the others. Then I'm going to add the remainder of the A squares onto the other side and repeat the process like this. It should look like this. Then I'm going to stitch just to the outside of the center diagonal line like that and flip it over, press and trim. Here are two of the flying geese units. You can see that I've stitched them on. I've trimmed the excess. Now I'm going to gently press them back and then use my iron. Then a little bit of steam. I'll do the same for the other two. Then I'm going to trim them down to the unit size. So check your pattern for the correct size for your flying geese unit. Then we'll be ready to assemble the block. Now that we've finished our flying geese and our center unit, it's time to assemble the block. Here's my center pinwheel in a square unit. I've got my flying geese, which become my star points. It goes like that, top, bottom, one side, and the other side. And then I take my remaining squares and I place them in the corners. Just like that. Now I'm going to sew them together. You could sew them in rows or columns, whatever makes sense for your brain. I'm going to do mine in rows. So I'm going to sew these two, then add this, these two, and then add this one, these two, and add this one. Here you can see I've sewed together the three sections of the block. All I need to do now is press them gently and then sew the parts together. I'm going to be pressing my seams toward the flying geese units in each section. It means this seam will go inward, this seam will go inward, these seams will go outward toward the flying geese, and these seams will go inward toward the flying geese. That way, when we sew the sections together, the seams will nest at these intersections, making it quick, easy, and accurate to put the final block together. Now we can assemble the block. And here you have the completed center of the block for the A Quilting Life block of the month, July 2022. I won't be showing you how to add the churn dash borders. You'll want to look at Sherri McConnell's video from January 2022 for instructions how to do that, and consult your pattern for those directions as well. I will come back with the completed full block in just a moment. And here is the completed block, including the churn dash border. Be sure to watch Sherri McConnell's video for this month's block of the month. For this particular block, that would be July 2022. You can find that at aquiltinglife.com. I'll leave a link to the video and to her blog in the video description below. So that's it for this month. I hope you'll join me again for the next video in this series when I will be sewing the August 2022 block of the month for aquiltinglife.com. I look forward to seeing you again soon.